So good morning to all of you. So sorry, we do not have a camera to show you, but I will try to just to show. So there is a big crowd in the room. So Akshaya, thank you so much for having accepted to give a seminar here at the Climate Economic Chair. So my name is Olivier Massol, and I'm head of the energy transition team here at the Climate Economic Chair. And I was extremely interested in the talk you gave a few months ago at the US Association for Energy Economics, which was entitled Startup Cost and Market Power Lessons from the Renewable Energy Transition. I thought it was extremely interesting to stimulate discussion on a type of modeling work that is also relevant from a public policy perspective. So maybe a few words of introduction. So dear colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Dr. Akshaya Jha. Do I pronounce correctly?
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Who is an assistant professor of economics and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Akshaya was already as an education in economics with a PhD from Stanford University, and also Bachelor of Science from Carnegie Mellon University. So you're somehow back to your alma mater, if I'm correct.
That's right.
Your research expertise is at the intersection of energy economics with industrial organization. So clearly something which is extremely relevant. And your work focuses usually on the supply side of wholesale electricity markets. So Akshaya, also I should mention something, which is the fact that this paper received granted Akshaya with the annual prize of the US Association for Energy Economics, and it's a young professional research prize that you won this year. So Akshaya, the floor is yours. Take your time. We are listening to you. Thank you so much again for having accepted to give this seminar.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to present this work that, as you mentioned, did win this award for the USAE. Hopefully I can live up to that award today in the presentation. This is joint work with Gordon Leslie, who's at Monash University in Australia. My name, as you mentioned, is Akshaya Jha at Carnegie Mellon University. I was also recently appointed to the NBR, which I'm very excited about. And this is a paper on measuring market power, accounting for the dynamic cost and constraints inherent to electricity production. And I'm going to argue that that's especially important in light of the renewable energy transition. On that point, there's been a rapid growth in solar PV installations across the world. So if you look, this is the gigawatts of installed capacity. If you look in 2010, roughly 18 gigawatts of solar capacity was installed. As of 2020, 144 gigawatts installed across the world. And that growth in solar PV is expected to continue over the next 10 years as well. In light of that growth in solar PV, it becomes instructive to think about what output from solar panels does. And output from solar panels displaces fossil fuel production during the day. Indeed, that's why we incentivize, why we subsidize solar and wind production and solar and wind, the building of new solar and wind capacity. So the output from solar panels displaces fossil fuel production during the day. And those displaced fossil fuel units have to incur startup costs in order to compete in the evening when solar stops producing, right? When the sun goes down, solar stops producing, these fossil fuel units have to decide whether or not to incur the startup costs necessary to compete in the evening. Some of those units are going to choose to start up, and therefore prices in the evening have to increase in order to allow those units to recover both their startup costs and their variable costs, right? It's no longer sufficient to just set prices equal to marginal cost in order for those units to recover their marginal cost. They also have to at least be made whole in terms of recovering their startup costs as well. Now, on the other hand, some of the units displaced by solar during the day are going to choose not to start up in the evening. And that's going to lead to decreases in competition in the evening. So in this paper, we're going to try to disentangle which of those two and which combination of those two features are going on in the data. Is it that prices increase as a consequence of units needing to recover their startup costs, or as a consequence of increases in the exercise of market power? To do this, we develop a dynamic framework that calculates a time series of competitive benchmark prices for each of the 24 hours of the day. So that we're going to calculate a competitive benchmark price for each of the 24 hours of the day that accounts for the recovery of both variable costs and startup costs. Okay. And we're going to apply this framework to a setting with world-leading rooftop solar penetration rates, and which is Western Australia. So I'm going to say WA for Western Australia. Rooftop solar capacity in WA more than doubled between 2014 and 2018, to the point where more than 1 in 4 dwellings in WA had adopted rooftop solar by the end of 2018. And rooftop solar produced over 20%, so a massive percentage, over 20% of the electricity generated in the middle of the day in 2018. Okay, so rooftop solar capacity boomed in WA between 2014 and 2018. And what that's led to, what I'm plotting here is the hourly average level of wholesale electricity demand in 2014 versus in the blue solid line versus 2018 in the dashed green line. And you can see that during the day, the hourly average wholesale demand is much higher in 2014 than 2018. That makes sense, right? Rooftop solar output starts producing, the amount of electricity required to be produced from the wholesale market decreases quite a bit due to that increase in solar output. Okay, so we see that, so just to recap, we see that our hourly average wholesale demand goes down coincident with the rooftop solar boom between 2014 and 2018. Now, if we move to the evening, we see that wholesale demand on average remains pretty similar in the evening. Again, that makes sense. Rooftop solar capacity stops producing once the sun goes down. Wholesale demand patterns in the evening remain similar across 2014 and 2018. Now, if we switch to looking at hourly average wholesale prices, so these are prices in the wholesale market, these are real-time prices, we see that during the day, average wholesale prices are much higher in 2014 than in 2018. Again, this makes sense. Rooftop solar output is producing during the day, leading to decreases in high marginal cost fossil fuel units. On the other hand, when we get to the evening, we see that wholesale prices are higher on average in 2018 than in 2014, relative to 2014. And again, our paper is motivated by what is driving this increase in wholesale prices coincident with the rooftop solar boom. Is it increases in the need for units to recover their startup costs, or is it decreases in competition driven by displaced solar units during the day, or units displaced by solar during the day, choosing not to start up in the evening? Okay, so our two most interesting empirical findings: increases in solar capacity lead to increases in operating profits and prices in the evening. And these increases are driven primarily by increases in the exercise of market power rather than the need for units to recover their startup costs. That being said, if you were to measure market power using the difference between market prices and the marginal cost of the marginal unit, so that's the static price cost markups, those static price cost markups are going to be 30% higher at sunset than those implied by our dynamic competitive benchmark. So you would significantly overstate the degree of market power exercised if you were just to use the static difference between prices and the marginal cost of the marginal unit produced. So this speaks to the importance of accounting for dynamics when measuring market power. So, in that vein, we speak to a small literature, but a literature kind of spearheaded by Mansur in 2008 and Marawant in 2014, speaking to the importance of accounting for startup costs and other dynamic costs and constraints when measuring market power. We contribute to that literature by developing a dynamic framework to calculate competitive benchmark prices that does not rely on an assumed model of conduct. So we don't need to assume anything about how firms compete. You know, you might be familiar with Cournot competition or supply function equilibrium or those sort of notions, or what information set the firms have, anything like that. We're just saying, here's a model of what would happen under perfect competition. Deviations from that model speak to market power. And we're going to demonstrate, and we demonstrate that there's a growing importance to measuring market power, accounting for dynamics. So the dynamics become increasingly important as renewable penetration rates rise around the world. So it's becoming increasingly important. It's becoming increasingly inadequate to measure market power simply thinking about the static difference between prices and the marginal cost of the marginal unit in a world where renewables are forcing fossil fuel units to start and stop frequently. Okay. Okay. So that's the overview of the paper. I'll pause here. I know questions are kind of held to the end, but I'll just pause here to take stock. If there are any clarifying questions, anything like that, I'm happy to answer before moving on. Okay.
No, I think you can continue if there's no questions.
Yeah, great. So I motivated this paper based on renewables because, you know, this is a climate economics lunch. But in the paper and, you know, in other talks, maybe more IO driven talks, the way I'd motivate this paper is thinking about setting competitive benchmark prices in industries with decreasing average costs. So firms in many industries have to incur sunk costs to start production. You know, typically you think about longer run costs like entry costs, you know, a Walmart or a Target or a big kind of supermarket entering a market or entering a new you know, area. But you know, I've been flying a lot more recently, and you know, even in the short run, thinking about, well, for a flight to get off the ground, it needs to have a crew. It needs to pay any fees associated with you know, like going into other airspace. It needs to pay fees associated with landing. So there are fixed costs even in the short run that are sunk at the time when a flight decides when an airline decides whether or not a flight decides, well, when at the point where an airline says, okay, this flight is going off the ground. So in order to start production in a lot of different industries, both in the longer run and in the shorter run, there are fixed costs that must be incurred. Okay, and therefore in those industries, setting prices equal to marginal costs does not allow firms to recover these sunk costs. So if, as an airline, you were setting the price of every ticket equal to the marginal cost of the flight, you would not make back, right? You would not recover those sunk costs associated with making sure the crew was there, any sort of fees associated with, you know, landing as well as airspace fees. Okay, so therefore, in those industries, airlines being the example I gave you, electricity obviously being the point of the paper, failing to account for sunk costs can lead to substantial overestimates of the profits earned due to the exercise of market power. Again, so this is a broader point that taking in dynamics into account is important when measuring market power. Okay. So with that, I'm going to switch gears and start talking about the conceptual framework underlying our analysis. In this conceptual framework, there's a vertical demand curve. There's unit 1. This is the marginal cost of unit 1. This is the marginal cost of unit 2, marginal cost of unit 3, marginal cost of unit 4. Just to make sure you guys can see my cursor, right?
Yes, we do see you.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm showing you here is a market without any solar during the day. And you can see here that intersecting demand with the marginal cost of the marginal unit gives us in this case the price both in a static world and in a dynamic world. So the D and the S refer to static and dynamic. And so what I'm assuming in this conceptual framework is that units 1, 2, and 3 started up in a previous hour, therefore they don't need to recover their startup costs. And we can just set the price equal to the marginal cost of unit 3 during the day. So that's the competitive benchmark price during the day in a world without solar. Our old school framework works, just saying the price equal to the marginal cost of the marginal unit gets us there. And so if we see an observed market clearing price here, this line, then the markup, the difference between the observed market clearing price and the competitive price, which in this case is just the marginal cost of the marginal unit, is the relevant measure of market power. Now, if we switch to the evening, and if we switch to the evening, nothing changes, right? So in this world without solar, the inelastic demand remains the same. We still intersect with unit 3, and because units 1, 2, and 3 were operating in the previous hour, again, I'm sorry, just to, somebody is unmuted. Let me, okay, so because in the evening, because there's no solar, the inelastic demand remains unchanged. You can intersect with the marginal cost of unit 3, and you see that we get prices equal to marginal cost of unit 3 again, and again the observed market clearing price minus the marginal cost of the marginal unit is the relevant markup, is the relevant measure of market power. Okay. So now let me switch gears and talk about a market with solar. So now if a bunch of solar capacity comes online, we see that demand goes from this curve here to this curve here. So it shifts to the left. And what that shift does is make unit 2 the marginal unit. And again, we're assuming that units 1, 2, and 3 started up in a previous hour. So therefore, we can set the marginal cost, the price equal to the marginal cost. And so price is equal to the marginal cost of unit 2 in a world with solar. I showed you before, in a world without solar, you set prices equal to the marginal cost of unit 3. Okay. And so we see that prices go down under the competitive benchmark during the day because solar shifts the amount of demand necessary to be satisfied in the wholesale market to the left. Now, when we shift gears and talk about solar, the market in the evening, note that because solar stops producing once the sun sets, the level of wholesale demand remains the same in a world with versus without solar. But in a world with solar, unit 3 no longer operated, right? So if you go back here, unit 3 did not operate in a world with solar. Therefore, they're going to bid in higher because they have to recover their startup costs, right? They're not going to simply be comfortable or okay with bidding in their marginal cost, because if they bid in their marginal cost, they wouldn't recover their startup costs. So they're going to say, in order for me to operate, I'm going to need this price here. And so unit 4 is also, since it also didn't operate, is also going to bid in higher than its marginal cost. So in this, the way we drew the figure, it's unit 4 now that is operating, not unit 3. And unit 4 is setting its price under the perfect competition equal to marginal cost of unit 4 plus startup cost divided by its quantity. So that's the price that's sufficient for unit 4 to break even. Okay. And so there we see that the competitive price in a world with solar is higher than the competitive price in the world without solar, which is the marginal cost of unit 3. Moreover, if you were to mistakenly measure the competitive price as the marginal cost of unit 3, so failing to take into account dynamics, failing to take into account that units 3 and 4 need to recover their startup costs in the evening in order to operate, you would overstate the degree of market power exercise, because you would think of the markup as being the difference between the market clearing price and the marginal cost of the marginal unit, which is MC3, rather than the true markup, which is the difference between the observed market clearing price and the dynamic competitive benchmark, which takes into account that unit 4 has to recover their startup costs. Okay, does that all make sense? And so in this world, what we're saying is that you should measure market power rents, the profits earned by units in excess of those that they would earn in the competitive benchmark, as this gray area here, right? So the profits earned by units in the world with solar is equal to this gray triangle plus this triangle here plus this triangle here. Sorry, plus these rectangles here. So actually, wait, sorry, yeah, I said that right. So, but the market power rents are those rents earned in excess of the profits earned under the competitive benchmark. So these profits, the profits that I'm kind of putting my cursor on, would have been earned even under the competitive benchmark, right? So those are called competitive rents. What's in white here above the marginal cost curve and above the purple curve once we get to unit, actually just units 1, unit 2. What's in the white here is the competitive rents. Okay, and so this is the market power rents. But if we were to mistakenly think of the marginal cost of unit 3 as being the competitive benchmark price, we would add, and this again, this is mistakenly add this checkered area to the market power rents. We would say, hey, it looks like units are earning market power rents equal to this big rectangle here, where in reality, they're actually earning market power rents only equal to this gray area. And that checkered area is part of what's called competitive rents, the rents that would be earned even under a competitive benchmark. Okay, so that's what the mistake is. If you don't use this dynamic competitive benchmark, you're going to overstate the degree of market power rents earned by units in the market. Okay. So now with that, I'm going to switch gears and talk very briefly, one slide on market structure in WA. And so I'm happy to take more questions on that. That's that portion of it in the Q&A. But really, this is a very simple market. WA sets a uniform day-ahead price and a uniform real-time price. So there's no explicit mechanism for units to recover their startup costs. So there aren't startup bids. There isn't, say in California, there's uplift payments. There isn't any sort of payment made to the units to compensate them for their startup costs. That's in contrast to US markets, at least. And so the fuel mix, but I was going to say the norm outside the United States is markets without these startup bids. The Spanish market is one exception outside the United States. The fuel mix in WA is 49% coal, 41% coming from gas, and 8.4% coming from wind. Importantly, there's very little utility scale solar capacity and no utility scale electricity storage. Something that's not on this slide, but I want to highlight, is that WA is relatively isolated. There are no major interconnections to other markets in in Australia at large. So WA is a relatively isolated market. The other thing I want to highlight is that there wasn't any major retirements or investment in new generating capacity over our sample period as well. So it's a relatively stable market during our sample period. Finally, there are 3 major suppliers in WA. There's Synergy with 50% of the market share, Alinta with 13%, and NewGen with 11%. So now let me switch gears again and start talking about the competitive benchmark model. So we're going to develop a framework to calculate competitive benchmark prices that accounts for recovery of startup costs. The first step, which I'm not going to go over in any level of detail just due to time, is going to be to estimate variable and startup costs for each generating unit. And to do so, we use, it actually turns out, daily feeder level data on input fuel use and hourly unit level data on electricity output. Okay, so we're just going to estimate these production functions using hourly electricity output and daily, essentially unit level input fuel use. In the second step, we're going to minimize the daily total production costs of satisfying demand in each of the 24 hours of the day. So let me go into a little more detail on that. So sorry for the explosion of math, but this is, relatively simple. So what's going on is we're minimizing, this first term is the static operating costs across units in the day. And so this is the energy costs. So think about that as what are the costs of increasing electricity output by 1 megawatt hour multiplied by the natural. This is making it into gas use rather than electricity output. And this is multiplying by the natural gas price to get us in Australian dollars. And then this is variable non-fuel operating and maintenance costs multiplied by output. But the key point is that we're also going to add in the startup gas cost, right? If a unit starts up, meaning they weren't producing in the previous hour and they are producing in the current hour, they're going to incur a startup cost. They're going to have to use startup fuel to do that. And then we multiply that by the natural gas price. And so we're going to minimize daily total operating costs subject to total supply being equal to residual demand. And so residual demand is going to be the amount of demand that the gas units in our market need to satisfy. So we're taking coal as inframarginal, and we're taking wind as and other sources as being inframarginal as well, which we think is reasonable. I'll get into that assumption a little bit more in talking about sensitivity analyses. We're also going to impose minimum and maximum output constraints. So each unit can either produce 0 or between M lower bar and K upper bar. So K is the capacity. That's pretty easy, right? You can't produce more than your capacity. But we found that it's important to impose these minimum output constraints. Just from an engineering standpoint, a unit cannot produce, epsilon. It just isn't technologically feasible. If they're going to produce at all, they have to produce at some minimum safe operating level. And so that turns out to be quite important once you start considering startup costs, right? Otherwise, if we didn't impose this constraint, a unit would just, to avoid startup costs, produce at epsilon in every hour, right? They would just be on in every hour, but they're producing epsilon. It'd be the equivalent of if for your car, idling it, so turning on the ignition, but then just keeping it on idle for, and again, that's not feasible from a car perspective. It's certainly not feasible from a power plant perspective as well. So it turns out to be important to put these minimum output constraints in place. So to think about these startup costs, I forgot to give you the car analogy, so I'll give it to you now. When you turn on your car to start it up, and even when you're driving out of your driveway, just starting it up uses up fuel, right? And so you could think about it as analogous to a car. If you're just driving at a normal speed on a highway, you're using a certain amount of fuel, but it's actually running pretty efficiently per unit, per mile traveled. Really, if you're stopping and starting, right, you start your car, drive a little bit, stop it, start it again, you're using a lot more fuel because you're using up the fuel in startup. And actually something that we're taking into account now, but in ongoing work, but that isn't in these slides, is also the ramping costs. As you're going faster and slower, you're also using up more fuel than if you were just driving at a steady pace. So those ramping constraints we're working on incorporating them into the framework based on reviewer comments. Okay, so now what we have by solving this model is an output for each unit in each hour under the least cost competitive benchmark. So, right, if we're trying to minimize costs, which is what would happen under the competitive benchmark, what would be the output of each unit in each hour? So in the last step, what we're going to do is set competitive benchmark prices that minimize daily total wholesale revenues, subject to the constraint that each generating unit has to earn at least weekly positive profits. So here, what we're saying is minimize daily total wholesale payments. So this is the amount of demand in the wholesale market. This is the price, which we're minimizing over. And we're going to say that total profits for each unit have to be greater than 0. So this is the total revenues that the unit earns. And this is the total cost that's incurred by the unit. So the total revenues have to be greater than the total cost. Otherwise, a unit would choose not to operate, right? If they're earning negative profits. But we're also going to have a static rationality constraint that the price has to be higher than the marginal cost of any unit that's producing above minimum output. And why is that? So that if any unit was producing above minimum output and earning negative profits from doing so, meaning if they could earn higher profits from going, they could earn higher profits from going down to minimum output, right? So that's the point we're making, is that, hey, if you're producing above minimum output, it's got to be that you're earning some marginal revenue on those units of production. Otherwise, you would decrease down to minimum output. Okay. So having run that competitive benchmark model, we see here the hourly average. The black line is the hourly average observed wholesale price, and you see a peak in the evening for the observed wholesale price. You also see a peak during day as well at 1 p.m. That's just yeah, but the big, sorry, not at 1 p.m., at 9 a.m. At 9 a.m. when people are going to work. But the bigger peak is in the evening when people come home from work. So if you were to just look at the red line, which is the marginal cost of the marginal unit, so that's the static competitive price, you're seeing that on average, the red line is only here. But once you take into account that you have to recover startup costs, right, that the units that were turned off due to solar during the day have to incur startup costs that they want to produce in the evening, you see that this blue dashed line is higher than the red one. And so that's where we get our 30% numbers, by saying, if you compare this black line to the red line and the black line to the blue line, you're going to see that dynamic competitive prices are, dynamic competitive prices are 30% higher than static competitive prices at sunset. For that, you only need the blue line versus the red line. The point being that the red line fails to account for the recovery of startup costs earned by fossil fuel units, whereas the blue line does take that into account. Okay. So the point being that if you would not be able, if you use this red line, you're overstating the extent to which the black line differs from the competitive benchmark, because you're failing to account for startup costs. Okay. So just to flag work in progress. So this is actually, this paper is R&R at American Economic Review. So we're working on revisions currently. And so this is kind of a great time to get feedback, because we're significantly revising the analysis for reviewers as well. So this is kind of the time to build in things. And what we are building in is first non-fuel startup costs, as well as ramping constraints. So if I go back here, this only takes into account the fuel startup costs associated with starting up. There are non-fuel costs you can think about. There's just, for example, chemicals and water that's used in order to get the unit to start up. But more importantly, perhaps, is the maintenance, right? If you're starting and stopping a unit, there's some sense in which there's an additional cost, a depreciation cost associated with starting up your unit. Sorry. Okay, and so we're going to incorporate those costs as well. We're going to account for generating capacity that's providing ancillary services. So units don't just provide energy. Some units also provide what are called ancillary services. So these are services that ensure that demand meets supply at every instant. So you can think about, okay, if on a short time horizon, I'm a gas plant, I need to increase or decrease my output slightly to ensure that the demand and supply balance. You can also think about voltage control. We need to ensure that the voltage across the grid is, the frequency across the grid, for example, is the same. Okay, so these type of services also are provided by gas-fired units. We're going to take that into account again in the work we're doing right now, which is work in progress. So I'm showing you right now with not taking these things into account, but again, that's what we're working on. We will also wanted to flag that we're subtracting coal units observed output from wholesale demand, and so this is conservative, right? Because this assumes that coal units are dispatched under a competitive benchmark in the same way as they're actually dispatched. So if a coal unit is off, we observe a coal unit to be off, we're going to keep it as off when we run our competitive benchmark. So competitive benchmark prices would be lower if we instead redispatched operating units, or redispatch operating coal units, right? So the coal units that are operating at say 60%, if we bump them up to 80%, the coal units that are off, we turn them on, we would have a lower competitive benchmark price. We would be less conservative. We think that what we're doing is actually better because coal units don't ramp up quite as fast as gas units. There are other constraints that for coal units, the operation of coal units that would be tougher to model. So we actually think the way we're doing it is the way that's most conservative. Okay, for that. So with my remaining time, and so I have 45 minutes, so I have roughly 7 to 10 minutes. Is that right? Sorry, just
right. Yeah, that's okay. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as a time check, so I'll skip over a little bit of what I have here, but I have 3 empirical methodologies. One is the descriptive trends. How do market outcomes evolve coincident with the solar boom from 2015 to 2018? We do a regression analysis. How do small increases in solar capacity impact wholesale demand patterns and thus market outcomes? And then we do a simulation analysis. How do larger changes in solar capacity impact market outcomes under the competitive benchmark, right? So we simulate what would if we increase solar capacity by 50%, how would competitive benchmark outcomes change? Just for time, I'm actually going to focus on the regression analysis, the results from the regression analysis in my remaining 6 minutes. Okay, so in this regression analysis, that we're going to consider a bunch of different market outcomes for hour of sample T and hour of day H. There's going to be just a constant term, and then we're going to include current and lagged wholesale demand. Those of you who are familiar with Davis and Houseman, which looked at the shutdown of nuclear power, what we add to a nuclear power plant and what happened to market outcomes, what we're adding to that framework is the lagged demand part. So it's going to be important to include lagged demand because, exactly what we talked about. Solar produces during the day, a unit turns off, and demand goes down. In the evening, when demand remains similar, there's going to be a change in market outcomes because of the fact that wholesale demand was lower during the day. So including lagged wholesale demand is important. Okay, and so we're going to consider a 10 megawatt increase in solar capacity. That's going to decrease wholesale demand by 10 times the capacity factor. So the capacity factor is what would 1 megawatt of solar capacity produce in hour T. We're going to use the observed capacity factor to measure that. Okay, so we're going to subtract from wholesale demand the output resulting from 10 megawatts of solar capacity. During the day, that'll be quite a large decrease in wholesale demand. In the evening, wholesale demand won't change because solar capacity doesn't produce when the sun goes down. Okay, and so standard errors are going to be clustered by week of sample. So I'm going to show you a lot of plots like this, so I want to go over this one pretty slowly. So this is plotting what would a 10 megawatt increase in solar capacity do to operating profits. So the points are saying what we're doing is we're using the prediction model with 10 megawatts of solar capacity added. We're subtracting what the predictions would be without that solar capacity added and plotting up the difference on the average differences. And so what we're seeing here is that 10 megawatts of solar capacity leads to much lower operating profits earned by fossil fuel units during the day, but interestingly, much higher operating profits earned by fossil fuel units in the evening. Okay, And so the question becomes, what drives that increase in operating profits earned by fossil fuel units in the evening? So increases in solar capacity lead to increases in operating profits earned in the evening. What drives that? Is it decreases in operating costs in the evening? Well, no. Here what we're seeing, and I'll put this on the same y-axis as the difference in operating profits. So that's why it's this kind of shrunk a little bit. You see that operating costs decrease during the day. So increase in solar capacity lead to decreases in operating costs. That makes sense, right? A 10 megawatt increase in solar capacity, that's going to produce some level of output, decrease the amount of operating costs incurred by fossil fuel units because they're producing less output. But we don't see any change in operating costs in the evening. Okay, so next, is it increases in competitive prices? Is it the case that competitive prices have to increase in the evening because these units have to incur startup costs? So here we see that there is an increase in competitive rents. So competitive rents are the profits that would be earned by fossil fuel units under the competitive benchmark if the market was competitive. And we do see that solar leads to increases in competitive rents in this 1 hour here where we choose to, prices are higher to recover startup costs. But by and large, competitive rents do not change much in the evening in response to increases in solar capacity. So instead, what we're left with is increases in market power rents. And here we see a big increase in market power rents in the evening due to increases in solar capacity. So solar capacity increases, leading to decreases in output from fossil fuel units during the day. Some of those units choose not to start up, leading increases in the exercise of market power in the evening, as demonstrated by the profits earned in excess of those that would be earned under the competitive benchmark. And so let me wrap up in the minute I have left, and then I'll answer that question. So just to summarize, production from rooftop solar displaces fossil fuel production during the day, leading to decreases in wholesale prices during the day. Some of the fossil fuel units displaced by solar during the day choose not to start up at sunset, leading to decreases in competition and therefore increases in wholesale prices and operating profits. So in ongoing work, we're going to look at evidence that firm level behavior from the big three, so Synergy, Alinta, and NewGen, is consistent with the exercise of market power in the evening. So we have some of that in the paper already. We're going to provide even more evidence that, hey, the firm level behavior is consistent with the exercise of market power. And then we're going to calculate the change in deadweight loss from solar induced changes in the exercise of market power. Okay, so what is the increase in deadweight loss in the evening as a consequence of this increased exercise of market power? As a consequence of this increase in market power. Okay, so I'll close by discussing policy implications. So we show in the paper that the competition benefits, so the competitiveness benefits from moving demand from the evening to the day are increasing with solar penetration. And so the technologies that can do that are electricity storage, which is becoming increasingly cost effective. So think about battery storage, or automated consumption adjustment, right? So thinking about end users, maybe with smart thermostats, or maybe with EVs that can charge differentially based on wholesale prices. Technology that can shift demand from the evening to the day. Right now on the retail side, there isn't, at least in the US, and I believe in Europe as well, there aren't incentives in place for end use consumers to care about what wholesale prices are, right? They're paying a monthly retail price that really doesn't shift with hourly variation in wholesale prices. Incentives that can impact the value of load shifting would be this real-time prices, exposing end use consumers to some of the wholesale price variation that exists, or startup cost bids or startup cost recovery. So these startup bids, so having suppliers bid in not just their step functions associated with their variable costs, but also startup cost bids saying, here's what my startup is, take that into account in the dispatch algorithm, or even make whole payments, paying units to make them whole for the fact that they had to recover startup costs are uncommon outside the United States. So the questions that we're motivated by in future work are, to what extent will incorporating startup bids improve the efficiency of markets, right, relative to just having it be a uniform price based on bids on the variable component of costs? And are the efficiency gains from incorporating startup bids or make whole payments increasing with renewable penetration? So with that, thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Thank you very much.
Should I go ahead and answer this question first before we jump into, or should I? Okay.
Yes, we have a question from someone who is remote, who missed a point, from Michelle Gouvernay, who said she might have lost important bits, as you're saying, that being able to exercise some market power in the evening by fuel dependent power producers is the only way to recover some of the fixed costs in the current scenario, unless we change. Sorry.
No. Okay. So yeah. So
okay.
The point, I think I get the point they're making is, wait, sorry, let me go back. I think, let me, I don't, okay. I was trying to find the right slide, but I think you're right. So right now, the way Western Australia, and most markets in Europe work is they set prices based that do not incorporate startup cost bids or dynamic costs, right? So these units, when they're deciding whether or not to bid into the market or what to bid in, you're right to say they have to exercise some degree of market power in order to recover their fixed costs. And when I say market power, you mean prices above marginal costs. So the concept of market power becomes a little bit murky because the way we're defining it is profits earned in excess of those that would be earned under a competitive benchmark. But you're exactly right that if we think about units bidding into the market, they're not going to bid in. Let me go back to this 2-period example. If they're not going to operate at their, if they bid in at their marginal cost, if prices are equal to their marginal cost, they're going to choose not to operate, right? Because they're not going to be able to recover their startup costs. So some degree of market power, prices in excess of those that are the marginal cost of the marginal unit, are necessary for, in this case, unit 4 to recover their startup costs. Exactly right. And so in terms of the market design, that's exactly what we're saying here. And you're spot on, is absent any sort of market design changes, and we're saying there should be market design changes, this is what's going on. This is what's going to have to happen. Either they're going to have to increase their bids in order to recover their startup costs, or they're going to choose not to operate. But what we're saying is that in the United States, what goes on, and in the Spanish market, so there are other markets that do this as well, but in the United States, primarily, they have startup bids as well. So the suppliers don't just bid in step functions based on how much output they are going to produce, but also here's how much my startup cost is. And then the dispatch algorithm takes that into account when they're minimizing as bid in costs. They also take into account, here's what the startup cost would be as well. And so then there's also what actually in the United States as well, these make whole payments. So ex post, if prices were not sufficient for units to recover their startup costs, they receive these make whole payments to make them whole, so that their startup costs are recovered. And actually, so there's a rich debate around, should we be paying them their bid? Is it pay as bid, right? If they bid in a certain amount of startup costs, should we be paying them as bid, or should we be doing some sort of form of lump sum make whole payments? That's actually a very interesting ongoing market design question that isn't solved. But certainly either startup bids or make whole payments are better than what's currently done in the majority of the world, which is neither, just setting prices based on the variable components. So I think you did not miss an important bit. I think you're spot on in what you're in what you said. Cool.
Thank you very much. Actually, is there some questions from the audience? Sorry, just
this mic.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for this very interesting analysis. I have a few questions about the impact on the mix that you consider. It was hear you in one of your question mark. First, in your model, you assume that producers that have solar technology, they don't have other technologies, in the sense that they cannot play in terms of also enforcing this market power by cross-subsidizing some units, which is most of the time the case between solar and gas units. And the other question is that it's very interesting to say that we can have market power even with price that decrease. This is, I think, something that for the competition authority is a new paradigm maybe that we have to consider when entering in the analysis of competition, when we have a lot of renewable penetration. And exactly regarding this last point is that, do you think that this effect is also related to a certain amount of exactly penetration of solar technologies with respect to the others, which may be a concern on one side on competition policy, and on the other side also in terms of market design. And I see it on the European side, where we prepare to integrate a very, very substantial share of renewables in the electricity markets. And the last question, even if I have many, since I've worked a lot on this kind of similar problems in another market, I was also thinking if this applies to wind, where I think that the startup costs are even, I mean, more difficult to handle.
Yeah, absolutely. So great questions. I'll take them in the order. Yeah, you mentioned them. So the impact on the fuel mix. So I do want to flag there that what we're very fortunate for our context is that there was a boom. Oh my goodness, why am I going back and forth all over the place? What we're very fortunate to have in our context is a boom of rooftop solar. So this is solar on homes. There's actually not a lot of, and this is strange to me as an Australia outsider, but there's actually not a lot of utility scale solar in this market. So this the question on producers with solar can and also that have own gas and coal units, they're going to use they're going to think about the market power implications of their joint set of portfolio. I think that's a very important point. In WA, it turns out it's mostly rooftop solar, so it's that producer, right? It's not the producers that own the solar; it's the homeowners with rooftop solar panels. At least in WA, so that's not as big of a deal for us. I do want to flag this paper by Lamp and Samano that exactly speak to your point here. I think it's Lamp and Samano, but they're saying that if there's a portfolio of units, if me as a supplier own a portfolio of units, some of which is solar, yes, I'm going to think about the market power implications across my whole portfolio when deciding what to withhold. So yeah, so that's a great point in our context, because we're focusing on rooftop solar in WA. It's largely rooftop solar. It's not as important for us. And so yeah, I think I take all your points and I agree completely. We think it's also very interesting that wholesale prices decrease during the day. So it's a kind of market power with decreasing wholesale prices, like you said. It's just there's these big decreases in wholesale prices during the day. We're focusing here on the evening when there is an increase in market power, but then we're not saying that in aggregate in any sort of way that prices are going up or something like that, right? Rooftop solar comes online, in aggregate, wholesale prices and wholesale revenues are going down, operating costs are going down, so certainly emissions are going down. So the aggregate implications of rooftop solar are positive. We're saying that there are market design implications, like you talked about, from the fact that there's this increase in the evening that's displacing somewhat the decrease in during the day. And so this speaks to the importance of shifting demand from the evening to the day. We don't want to say anything. Yeah, sorry, go for it.
No, I mean, this is an interesting view on a shift, which is a little bit different from the interpretation of the duck curve, because we are used to think about, yeah, look, that's a step cost, they are in and out. But the fact that there is also the strategic behavior is what it is, I think, new. And especially if you say that it comes from very, I would say, simple installation as rooftops, which in Europe, by the way, they are quite passive because they have a completely different incentive. They don't even go to the market.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah, so I have a paper. Well, I have a paper on the nuclear phase out in Germany, and so we're doing a follow-up work, and so I'm gonna follow up with you on that point about gas.
Soon you can do it the same for France, but it's not phasing out. It's a problem of maintenance. But
no, yeah, exactly. It's a funny point of that paper is that, you know, Germany's increasingly importing electricity from France, but that's a separate thing. But anyway, so but I take, so I think I agree with you. The kind of one of the novel points is that there's this dynamic strategic interaction going on. Most people focus on the daytime outcomes, right? Solar produces during the day. Let's focus on what happens to the market during the day. Not so much what happens in the evening. And so that's, I do think that's kind of a key point, one of the interesting points. And I did want to take your last point on wind as well, which we think of as being even more difficult. I agree completely, because it's more difficult to forecast, right? Wind typically produces during the evening, but it's not as easy to say, oh, it produces during the day and then it turns off in the evening, right? So both from an empirical perspective, us as analysts, but also from a market participant standpoint, figuring out, well, okay, when should I start up? When should I expect to start up my unit? When should I expect to stop my unit? Becomes much more difficult for wind when you have to forecast, okay, when are they going to be producing? And, you know, in some markets, wind is becoming like the Spanish market. I think wind is becoming, for example, quite a big portion of the production. What was I going to say? One last thing on that was, what was I going to say? Yeah, I was going to say that also talks about the mix of units within gas, and the coal to gas mix of units is, we're seeing, at least not in Western Australia yet, but certainly in other markets, that there's increasingly a switch away from coal to gas units that can start up and ramp up more quickly as a consequence of this increase in penetration from renewables. In WA, it's not yet there because there's sufficient gas to handle the current levels of rooftop solar. But if you were to double, for example, the rooftop solar capacity, you would start to see some of these coal units be mothballed and shut down in favor of kind of these gas units, and maybe even more builds of new gas units. So that's another interesting point as well. Sorry, I think I hit everything. I was writing them down as you were mentioning. Let me know if I missed something as I was going.
The question is that the results you show us are very interesting, but but at the same time, they have to be somehow they do depend on the mix that you are considering, and also on the market design.
Absolutely. And I think different market designs, different mixes would potentially yield different results in terms of the degree of market power exercise versus the need to recover startup costs. Indeed, perfect. Yeah, agree completely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akshaya. As far as I'm concerned, I have just one remark and a suggestion. First, first of all, congratulations for having mixed, you know, two literatures. First, the literature coming from power engineering on unit commitment problem, because basically it's all about this, and you're trying to incorporate that into the IO literature. So that's I do really appreciate that bridge. Thank you for that. And by the way, I have a remark from well, listening to you, and especially when looking at this graph, I was thinking, well, if I'm, you know, if we start to be at in the evening, and if I am one of these big three producers, and I do realize that among the capacities that will be needed to meet the demand, you know, at 7 p.m. or at 6 p.m., my capacity will be needed, meaning that the residual load computed from the load minus the total capacity of my opponents, my rivals, makes my capacity necessary to be. Then I know that at some point I will be capable to exert some market power. So as you have a detailed statistics about about market, in Western Australia. I was wondering if you are capable to measure, this propensity to somehow exact market power depending on the circumstances and depending on my capacities, pivotal or not, from a brief.
Yeah, that's great. I'll do that second one first because I'm excited about that. And I'm excited about both of them, but I think I'm excited to say that we have done that. So it's we use these inverse semi-elasticities.
Okay.
To say for each of the big three, exactly right. When they're, like the steepness of the residual demand curve, does that determine whether or not they withhold output? And yes, we are seeing that when they are pivotal, when their capacity is needed, they're exerting more market power. So that's the thing that we have done that. Yes. And so that's I was scrolling to my slides to see if I have that in my backup slides, but unfortunately I took that out. But
that's
so
great. But that's for many possible, fixes from a regulatory perspective. One way would be to somehow let's do a restructuring only on the gas-fired assets, so as to increase competition, among those players somehow.
Yeah. So one, so that's one. And another one that's been brought up is forcing these suppliers to have forward contracting. So if they have forward contract positions, then they have less incentive to exercise market power relative to their forward position. So that's another one but I agree with you, having that's yet another market design change that could be made is either forward contracting or some form of restructuring of at least the gas portion to make sure that their incentives aren't like when they're pivotal to, really exercise market power. Sorry, should I go? I was going to switch gears and talk about your other point, but if you want it, should we? Do you have anything more to say on the residual demand portion or the? Okay, so the other thing I love your point on bringing the engineering lit on mixed integer dispatch problems to IO, and I think there is I just love that. I don't know. I hope we've cited properly the engineering lit in our paper. If not, let us know. But I think we think about that exactly right. This competitive benchmark is very much inspired by the dispatch problem that's actually solved by these market operators, but also the engineering style lit on what would be a least cost mixed integer dispatch problem. And I can tell you from experience, solving that problem has been took the bulk of our time in Nitro and MATLAB, just like all the constraints were that. So I think that is a core contribution of our paper is bringing it to the IO lit, but we recognize that we didn't. This model wasn't something we came up with from nothing. It's there's been a rich engineering literature on solving these type of mixed integer problems that I've certainly taken advantage of when coding it up myself.
That's great.
Sorry, I'll end with this. Yeah. So thanks so much. Is there? I'm happy to field any other questions as well.
Some other questions? No. So let's close the session. So once again, Akshaya, thank you so much for having accepted to give this seminar this morning, especially as you were not totally caffeinated, as you said in the beginning. So we are definitely looking forward to seeing you in Europe. As you're now working on Germany, at some point you may have to come to Paris to explore the French way of designing markets. That will be an interesting talk that we will have. So we are looking forward to keep in touch. And once again, thank you so much on behalf of the whole team for your excellent presentation today. And of course, we keep the finger crossed for the revision at AIER and let us know about that.
Absolutely. I will keep you guys in the loop. Thanks so much for this invitation again. I really enjoyed giving the presentation. I hope to see you guys in person sometime soon.